So, hello, Smashing fans and followers. It's myself, Scott, here today, and our guest today needs no introduction. It's the amazing Rachel Andrew, editor-in-chief of Smashing Magazine, and a lot of other titles, I'm sure. How are you doing? And can you hear me? Nope.
Yeah, I can hear you now. Sorry, it broke up slightly there. Yep. Hello. Yeah, it's really good to be here.
So, how are you doing today?
I'm all right. I'm sat in San Francisco in a hired meeting room because I thought that being in the hotel, I'd likely to have like housekeeping wander in and sort of say hello. So hopefully it'll be a bit quieter here.
Nice. Yeah, everybody that's attending, please let us know where you're from today. I just got this in the mail yesterday, so I've got some reading material, the new Smashing print book, Inclusive Components by Hayden Pickering. So looking forward to that for the weekend. So Rachel, today you're going to be talking about, well, not talking, you're actually going to be coding CSS Layout Live.
Yeah, so basically I've got a sort of component. I just basically grabbed something off the BBC homepage because it was a sort of a good example component. I've not built it before. What I went through is I built the HTML and I tried not to think too hard about how I would do the layout because I wanted to kind of do that in the webinar and just talk through how I might build bits of it. So I don't know how far we'll get, but hopefully it'll be interesting in terms of the choices that I make as we go through creating this. And then we'll have, for members, we'll have a bit of time afterwards. I'll answer some questions. So yeah, so we'll just see how it goes. Very
awesome. Just so everybody knows, if you have to duck out early, we are going to be posting this in the Smashing channel after. If you need to check out the Q&A after, we're also live streaming on YouTube again today. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to this. You did something similar at one of the Smashing comps. I thought it was pretty brilliant how you did that live. So really looking forward today. So
cool.
On that note, Rachel, I will hand the screen over to you.
Okay, so I think I just screen share.
Yeah.
Let's see what happens. Let's see, can you see my screen?
Good to go.
We can, excellent, right. Okay, so as I say, I've not built this before. What I did was I wanted to find something that was just a sort of a fairly standard looking layout that you might want to build. So I just grabbed this screenshot from the BBC website, which obviously has some various bits and pieces that we might want to lay out. And I thought we'd try and kind of build that just as an example of how we might build a component. What I did was I created here some HTML. That's all I've done. So this is the HTML. I've not looked at how the BBC have written their HTML, basically because I think they've obviously got an awful lot more going on than most of us have when we lay out a page. So I've just sort of built this with some fairly straightforward HTML, and then we're going to write the CSS to sort of make that work, hopefully. As I say, I've not tried to build it, and I've tried not to think too hard about it beforehand because I would like to be able to kind of describe what I'm doing. And we'll see where we get. And what I'll do at the end is I'll tidy it up and I'll pop it up somewhere on CodePen or what have you, so that we can you can have a look at the final built component and sort of see what we did. So I've also got it in front of me on my iPad, so I don't have to constantly keep switching back and forward, but we'll have a look at the different parts. So I guess if I was looking at something like this, let's get rid of the thing. If I was looking at something like this, you know, I'd be sort of identifying what I had here in the document. I've obviously got a bit of navigation at the top. And then we've got sort of various news items. This is kind of like the headline news item here. And then we've got some more major news items. And then we've got this sort of listing of other things that you might want to go and visit. So we've got a few things going on there. Now, I think I'll start fairly simply with this navigation. I'm going to concentrate on layout rather than any other styling, and we'll sort of see where we get to. So we'll have a look at the navigation there. Let's go back to my code. So I've got that marked up. I've got the navigation with a class of countries that's got a UL inside it. So let's write some CSS. So we've got countries UL, and I think that looks like a flex layout, and that's a fairly standard flex layout. So let's say display flex, and let's see if live reload is working. Let's let's use Firefox. Right, yes, so here's my navigation up here. Now I've replaced all of the images with images of cats because I didn't really want to be looking at Boris for the entire workshop. I think cats are just generally preferable. So we've got the navigation here, and you can see there that the bullet point has stayed. Although we've made that into a flex container, the list items are kind of retaining their listiness. So although they're in a flex formatting context, you know, those are list items, they keep their bullet. So we probably would want to get rid of that. And often in your standard style sheet, you might just remove the list bullets on things like that, but we'll do that for everything. So that's the UL. So say list style, none. Let's just make sure there's no margin and padding and things knocking around that's going to cause us problems. So there we go. We can now, we've got rid of those bullets, and it's kind of, they've all in Firefox. I'm in Firefox there. We could actually use the gap property. I don't know, say 1M. To space out the list items, because gap, row gap and column gap is implemented in Firefox. Sadly, it's not implemented in Chrome. So kind of in reality, I'm probably going to want to put a margin for now on my list items to space them out. Or padding or what have you. But I'm going to need to do that with something other than using the gap property. It'd be really nice when that's implemented in Chrome for Flexbox as well, because we won't have to do margins on flex items. I want the LI, don't I? Ooh. So let's just pop a margin on for now. Let's see what that gets us. Right, there we go, that'll do. So that's kind of that navigation. I say I'm not going to go too far down the line of styling every bit of all the text and things, because I want to concentrate on layout today. I may well tidy it up a bit and try and make it look a bit more like the BBC thing later. So that's kind of my navigation. Now, the reason I would use Flexbox for that is that really we just want to have these items sort of nicely laid out next to each other. Now, if I wanted them all to spread right across the screen, I could use, say, justify content space between to space them out. But on the example that I'm looking at, they're all just sort of aligned to the left there, aren't they? So I'm going to just leave them like that and just use margins to space them out. So actually, while we're looking at that, I've now got this main sort of area of the page. There's kind of two things here. There's this sort of main part with all the news items, and then there's, I guess, like a sidebar really with some extra ones. And so when I marked this up, I sort of split that into two sections. So what I've got is, so that's our navigation there. I've got a div with the class of panel, which is kind of the whole thing. And inside that, I've got the main area, which is my main news items. And then I've got an aside down the bottom here, which I'm using for those extra little bits and pieces. As I say, the markup's a little bit arbitrary. It was sort of just to try to mark it up reasonably sensibly. And I sort of felt like these were kind of lists of things, so they're all marked up as lists. So we're going to have a look at that panel. I want to lay that out. Now, I think everyone looking at that is probably thinking, yeah, that's a grid layout. That looks like a grid. Those things are lined up in 2 dimensions. So we're going to want to use grid layout. And I'm going to have 2 grids, I think. I'm going to have a grid which wraps the whole area, so the main and the aside, gets that into 2 columns. And then I'm going to have a grid inside the main area to deal with the bits and pieces. And we'll just worry about the desktop view for now, and we'll see where we get on if we manage to make it responsive as well. So let's go back to the CSS. So it's called panel. It's amazing how your brain sort of forgets what you're talking about when you're actually trying to do this and talk at the same time. But there we go. So panel. Right, so I want a grid layout. So to use grid layout, I have to say display grid. And immediately we've got a grid formatting context, as we call it, which means that the direct children are going to now be grid items. Now, I'm going to make this a 5-column grid, and I'm going to use sort of 4 columns for the main area and then 1 column for the aside, I think. So let's do that. So grid template, columns, repeat, 5, 1, FR. There we go. And let's see what we've got now. Okay, so we're now in Firefox here. And if we inspect our grid, where is it? Oh, we're right down here. Okay, there it is. So there we go. We've got our grid there, and we can see that we've actually got this 5-column grid. And because we haven't done anything with the items yet, they've positioned themselves with auto placement one element into each cell of the grid. We've actually only got 2 direct children of that grid. So we've got 1 in the first column and 1 in the second column. So when we can sort of now start to position the items that we've got. So let's go back here. And we had main and an aside, didn't we? So let's that. And I'm going to say grid column 1, 2, 5, I think. There we go. Ah, right, yes, okay, so that's looking a bit better. We've now got the main area here is actually spanning over the 4 tracks. And then this sort of sidebar is down the side here. And that's starting to look a bit more like the layout that we wanted to get, because we've got the sidebar down here. And then we've got this main area which you can start to play with. So let's deal with the main area for now and see what we can do with that. Now, what would be nice is, in an ideal world, I could just use my main grid on the panel and kind of inherit that into the main area. Now that would work in Firefox. So if we say, so let's go to our panel main. So this is that main area. And I'm going to say display grid, template, columns, subgrid. So I'm now actually using the grid on the parent on the child here. And if we have a look on main, you see it's a subgrid. And it's actually using the column tracks on the parent grid, because that's how subgrid works. When you declare your track listing as a subgrid, if subgrid is implemented, then all of the track listing from the parent is going to be copied down to the child. Now, I think looking at my image, we've got a sort of a bit of a gap between those items. So we probably want to also have a gap in our grid. And because we're working from the parent grid, we can set it there. So I'm going to say 20 pixels. I'm not sure what it is in reality. And if we then go back into Firefox here, you can see that the gap is also inherited into the subgrid. Now, that would all be great if everybody implemented subgrid, but sadly they don't. And so if we go into Chrome here, Chrome doesn't implement subgrid, and so we don't get the grid. So for now, you're going to have to use create a separate grid on your nested items. Now for this, that shouldn't be too bad. What we could do is we could leave that subgrid there, so that if you are in a browser that supports subgrid, it should use it. So if we say grid template columns, and we're just going to create a 4-column track grid, which should more or less line up anyway with the parent. I think that should work. Is that not reloading? Oh, that's IE. That's why that's not working. this doesn't work in IE. There we are in Chrome. And that's working fine. So we've now got our grid on our main element and our grid on our side element. And we're going to want to do something with the content of main. So we'll go back into have a look at our image and see what that looks like. So what we've got in the main area is we've got this sort of the first item has got more content than the other items to start with. And it also has this image here, and then we've got the text next to it. So we want to kind of do something with our first item to try and get a layout that looks a bit like this. So let's have a look at what we've got. Let's see if our markup lets us get anywhere near that. Let's see. So right, that's this one here. So it's the first item here. So we could go with first child, or we could, if we want to, just add a class of, say, feature, so we can easily target it. And we've got in here, we've got an image, and then we've got the content. Now, I think that what we'd probably want to do here is we're going to want to put some sort of container around our content, because that means that we can deal with the image and the content separately when we do the layout. Otherwise, we'd have to kind of get every little bit of the content and lay it out, which kind of wouldn't be ideal. So I think what I would do if I was looking at this HTML is I would add a wrapper around things. I would probably also add a wrapper around images. A few little weird edge cases happen with images that are direct children of the grid. And so sometimes it's just a bit easier just to have an element in there, can sort of save you some hassle. So let's have div class equals image around our main image. And then say div and content. I don't think I've used that anywhere else. And then I think we've got all sorts of stuff here. Right, I think that's probably it. Right. So we've got image and we've got content inside feature. I think I'll probably need to actually reload these things now. So now let's have a look at feature. So feature is going to span over 3 columns of our grid. So let's see if we can do that first. Nope, that's not worked. Hang on, let's see where we are. If we actually pick this up in the live reload, I'm not sure. What's happening there? So why is that not picking up? Is that not a direct child? Okay. Bit of live debugging for you because I don't know what's going on there. Right, let's get it with DevTools. So I've got a classes feature. It should be. And it's not. Ah, I know why. Right. So inside my panel, I've not got a direct child. I've got that, and I was sort of treating that as if it was a direct child of main. It's not. I need to do something with news first because I've got a bit of structure here. So that's what's going on there, is that I need to make news into a grid as well. Now, this is where having SubGrid would be really great, because we could just keep on inheriting SubGrid all the way down. So if we've got news here, and I need to make news a grid. So to use SubGrid, you've got to have a grid formatting context. Obviously, you've actually got to be already in grid layout. So we should be able to inherit the grid here. Let's see if that works. So news is now a subgrid. Yeah. And we've got our LI there. There's a feature. So we want the LI also to be a grid so that we can lay the items out on that. So let's get rid of those list bullets. And obviously, if we're in Chrome, then we're going to need to actually define our grid as well on this item. Where's Chrome? There's Chrome. Now what's going on there? Well, this is fun. I wonder if I've got some broken markup somewhere. Or I've hit a bug with using all this. I'll tell you what I'm going to do is I'm going to back out of using SubGrid at all, because I am wondering if we've got something odd going on here. So what I've got is I've got my main panel. And in fact, let's just debug this as I would if I was sort of stuck on this there, because something odd's going on there. And I think it's probably because I'm using SubGrid and trying to sort of inherit that grid down. So let's not use SubGrid for now. Let's just debug what's going on with my grid layout here. Let's just reload that to make sure it's connected. So this one's Chrome, and this one here is Firefox. And now they're looking the same. As I say, I think that we had a bit of a problem there with trying to overwrite SubGrid. So let's just look at this as an independent grid for now. So I've got some list bullets on here that I want to get rid of. So let's get rid of those so we can sort of tidy up how it looks. So the list bullets are going to be on the UL with a class of news. So let's go to news and we'll say list style none. And again, we'll just make sure we've got no margins and padding lurking around there. I've not used any kind of reset style sheet, because I always think if you use reset style sheets in demos, like mysterious things occur that people might not, if you're not used to using a reset style sheet, might not know what that is. So I much prefer just to sort of show you. So here we go. So we now got the same thing in both, which is always nice. This is Firefox, so we can look at the grid, and if we go to news and say display grid, so that's what we've got there. Now what we need to do is we need to make sure that news is sort of taking up the same space as main. So if we look at main, and we've got display grid on main, and that takes up all the space. So what we want to do with news is we want to make sure it spans over 4 row tracks of the grid, which I think is the problem we were having before. We weren't actually spanning our new grid container over. So that's kind of what my problem is. So I can fix that. So if I go to news, we've nested news inside main. And what I need to do with news is I need to say grid column 1 to -1. Now using -1 is quite useful because that is always going to target the end line of the grid, the explicit grid. So if you've defined a grid with grid template columns, you can target the end line of it with -1. So hopefully, that's looking a bit better, isn't it? So we've now got this. I think in our image, it's taking up 3 tracks, isn't it? So yes, so we wanted to take up another one. So that's feature. So actually, we're going to go to line 4. And that should fix that layout, I think. Ah, that's looking better. So there's our cat, and there's the other image from the other piece of news. So we're sort of getting somewhere here. I mean, it's not quite looking like our layout, but we're actually making some progress. We've got our main image here and the content next to it. So if you remember, we marked this up into two sections, the image and the content, so that we could actually lay those out as a grid. So those are inside feature. So we've got image and content. So let's go down to feature. So we've got feature, image. Now I want that to be in the second track. So I'm going to say grid column 2. If you're using grid lines and you're only spanning one track, you only need to have the start track and grid row 1. And then we've got content. And that's grid column 1 and grid row 1. No. What have we got here? Oh, I know why we've not set up our grid on feature. So we need to say display grid. And what's that look like? Is it sort of even? No, it's not. We're spanning sort of 2 tracks there. So let's say 1 FR, 2 FR, and see what that gets us. Okay, that's sort of getting somewhere. Because we're not using SubGrid, we're going to need to put our gaps back in between the items. So if we look at the panel, we had a 20 pixel gap. So I'm thinking we probably want to have a 20 pixel gap between all of these things. So let's try that there on news. And we're also going to need to do the same on feature. Let's see where that gets us. Okay, this is looking a bit better, isn't it? This cat's got a very sad little face. We've got the content here, and we've got our image here, and that's spanning over 2 tracks. We've got the next image, because once we've sort of placed this item, because we wanted this item to be in a specific place on the grid. But what then happens is that grid continues to auto place the rest of the items. So it's just carrying on with the items. We've got the next one appears here, and then this one, and this one, and this one, and so on. I think we could probably do with a bit of padding somewhere to push that off the navigation. Maybe we'll put a margin on the navigation, wherever that is. So let's say, see if that makes a difference. Yeah, it's looking a bit better, isn't it? So, okay, we're sort of getting the basic structure here of our layout. We've got the content, we've got an image, we've got the next image. Now, if you look at this layout here, what we've got going on is we've got this sort of updates on the election campaign trail box, which is down bottom left. Now, I've actually got that at the end of my listing. It's not really a news item. It's sort of another different sort of box. Now, it might be that I do want that to appear in that location, but leave it where it is in the markup for whatever reason. Now, you could do that. You need to be a little bit careful when doing something which would take things out of the flow of content, because when you use grid layout or Flexbox, the sort of the speech order of your content and the tab order of the content follows the document source. So if you've got an element in the document source and you then sort of display it kind of out of sync of where it behaved in the source, that could cause problems. It might make it difficult to tab around between the items. So you do need to be very careful when doing this sort of thing. If you rearrange things from where they are in the source, make sure that you're not causing an unusual sort of tab order or reading order for someone who is hearing the stuff being read out but can also see it, because not everybody who's using something which reads out their screen is using a screen reader and completely blind. There's lots of reasons. Increasingly, people are using things that are actually telling them what's on their screen even though they can see it. But sort of we'll just have a look, because it sort of shows the way that grid behaves. So I think I might just take this. I've got a class of live already on that, so that's our live bit. So let's see if we can sort of position that into a place on our layout. So go back down the bottom here. We've got feature. So the other one then that we're going to play around with is live. So let's see if we can just place that. So I'm going to put that then on grid row 2 and grid column 1. Let's give it a background color, because it has a background color on the BBC. Right, there we go. Okay, so that's kind of what we've got there. We've got that box has now ended up on this side here, which is, it's been positioned in that area. And if we pop on the grid inspector, so we can actually have a look at our grid. We probably look at the grid on news, don't we? So there's the grid on news. And you can see how that's now been placed down into that position. And that was last in the set of items that we've got here. So basically we've got this one, which we've positioned, and we've given it its own structure. We've then got the next auto-placed one. We then visually have this live box down here, and then the next auto-placed image is placed after it. What you will find is if you mix positioned things and auto placement, you need to be relatively careful, because the auto placement will start at the first available space to place an item. So that means if you've got a layout where you've positioned everything really carefully, and then you introduce another direct child into that grid container, it could pop up in a weird place. If you've left some white space, that auto-positioned element could suddenly sort of pop up at the top of your document. So if you're seeing something like that happening when you're working with grid, it's usually because you've placed everything, but you've left some white space and you've got something which you haven't yet positioned. So most of the time, if you're using auto-placement, you just auto-place everything, or you might, as we're doing, very carefully place a couple of items, and then let auto-placement fill the gaps. Or you're going to position everything with line-based positioning or grid template areas, and not leave any gaps for things to sort of pop into. An advantage of using grid template areas is that does sort of fill the entire grid, so you can sort of get away without having these little spaces where things might sort of hop up and fill a gap. But it's kind of worth knowing that happens. And if we look here in Chrome, we've got the same layout, so that's a good start if things are actually behaving in the same way. And so the reason this is all spaced out a bit is because we've got in the grid next to it, we've got this this sidebar is in there. So as we sort of sort all this out, it should tidy up the layout. How far we'll get, I'm not sure, but I may well, out of the interest of the demo, tidy it all up and pop it on CodePen later anyway. So this is all sort of starting to look pretty good. What else have we got that we might want to lay out? I'd like to look at some other things maybe that use Flexbox. So what have we got in our layout? We've got these little things here at the bottom of each card. Now these look like perfect sort of little flex layouts. They're a bit like the navigation at the top, aren't they? It's just little things that are just sort of positioned up next to each other. So maybe we'll have a look at those. What have we called those? They're meta, aren't they? Yeah, so they're a URL, the class of meta. So let's style those up. Now they're also a list, so let's get rid of the listiness. Oh, yeah, there we go. That sort of worked, hasn't it? They're sort of squashed up. We could do some padding on these boxes, really, couldn't we? I think it's they're sort of squashed up there. So let's close that so we can see what it looks like that. So we're going to want to put a margin perhaps on these to spread them out. It's going to be very nice when we have got gap, isn't it, in Flexbox. Let's just put it on the right of them for now. Let's see what that looks like. Nope. What did I put that on? Oh, need the LI in there, don't I? I hope this, if nothing else, this just shows you that even people who know CSS really well just constantly fumble around with it and make mistakes. So that's sort of like that thing, isn't it? It allows us to separate those out. As I say, well, the nice thing about the gap property is that you wouldn't end up then with a margin on the outside of each item. You'd only get it in between when you use gap. It just goes in between the elements, which is much nicer than using margins. Because the thing with Flexbox, if you use, sometimes you want to have margins either side of things, and then you end up kind of having to put a negative margin on the outside of the Flex container to pull it back over. And that's all a bit of a kludge. In fact, I think it seems more kludgy these days that we've got so much better ways to do CSS layout. And when you have to start negative margining things around, it feels really kind of clunky and old fashioned. So yeah, so the gap property would allow us to get around that, but that's kind of working, isn't it? So let's have a look at, so we've got these all over the place. So that's sort of collapsing down. And that is, what else could we be doing in here? I'm going to go to live and I'm just going to put a bit of padding on that box because that's all. I did earlier when I was testing out the live reload stuff. I added a few things, like I made the images max width 100%, so they would be contained in their grid area, like a sort of responsive image. And I used box sizing border box so that we had an easier job with the sizing of things. So that's looking a bit better. So I could obviously carry on with this and style up various bits and sort of make it look even more like the BBC thing. But what I wanted to do was, you know, while we've still got a little bit of time left, think about your friend and mine, Internet Explorer 11. And here it is. And this cat looks very, very depressed to be in this IE11 layout. Yeah. Now you can see that some things have taken effect in here. The flex stuff has worked because that works in IE11. And obviously things like when we've removed list bullets and so on, that's all worked. But the layout is pretty much, the grid layout is displaying in normal flow. Now that's what you get. If you don't make any changes to layout, or if you use a layout method that is not understood by the browser that you're working in, then it's going to be in normal flow, which is block and inline layout. That's like the tried and tested layout. What happens when you put things in an HTML document and stick it on the web? You get normal flow. Now, increasingly, and depending on your visitor numbers, it may well be that just letting your content display in normal flow turns out to be okay. I think it's probably a bit early for most of us to say, oh, it's okay to leave IE11 just like this. But it may be, if you look at your stats and you've got, you know, vanishingly rare people coming in Internet Explorer, then you might just say, well, hang on, I'm just going to leave this in normal flow because this is readable. You know, you can read all of this. It might not be the most prettiest layout or actually the most usable, really, because it's a bit difficult to sort of see some of the structure of it, but it is readable. And that's much better than people arriving into a kind of jumbled mess. And so that might be something you can do. Maybe not now, maybe in a year's time or 2 years' time, you're going to be building something and say, you know, I don't need to worry about IE11 and the fact that it doesn't support grid layout. I'm just going to leave this in normal flow. But let's say that's not okay. And you think, well, I need to do something about this. Well, there's various things that we can be doing in CSS to create fallbacks for old IEs. So let's have a look at what we've got and just see what we can do quickly to kind of demonstrate that. Let's take something small in the layout. So let's look at the feature itself, perhaps. So I've got this feature, which has got the image and the content. So let's find that in my CSS. So if I'm in IE and I know that that doesn't support grid layout, and I think, well, what am I going to do with that? Well, I think probably the first thing I would want to do is, because I know I'm probably going to use floats as my fallback. So let's make feature, let's give it a clear fix so that it sort of contains its floats. Yeah. So this is essentially your clear fix hack. We'll say display block and clear both. Right. So that makes, helps you spell it. That makes that box, that feature box, is now going to sort of contain its floats because we're using a clear fix hack to do that. So that gives us a bit of a starting point for what we're going to do next. So if we look at that again, right, so we're going to want to float the image right and the text left, okay? Let's see if that works then. So feature, image, float right, and give it some sort of width, aren't we? Let's try, rather than doing any complicated maths, let's just try that for now. You can always play around with it. And content. Let's make that 30% and see if that will give us a bit of a gap between it. Let's see what that's done. There we go. So that's kind of given us something. It's all a bit wide, isn't it? Because we're not dealing with the rest of the layout yet. But we've got a floated thing there, and we've got our text on the left and our image on the right. What I might do with IE in this situation is basically make my layout centered, so that I'm making it a bit smaller, and then sort of play around with flow layout and just do some styling up. So I've done that with IE as an example. Now, the thing with using floats when things become grid items is that when a floated thing becomes a grid item, the float is removed, but you can see that something very odd is occurring here. What's happening in Firefox now is that, okay, the float doesn't apply once we're in the grid layout, but the width that we have added does, and the width then becomes the width of the area that the item is in. Now, that obviously is not something that we wanted. We wanted this just to be used by IE, and we want the float to be overwritten by grid, which it is, and we don't want that image, that width there, making our things too small. So what we could do here is we could use a feature query. So if I say @supports display grid, and then what I need to do is I need to get those columns. So I've got feature.image and I've got feature content. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set their width back to auto. Now let's see if that's worked. So, right, so that's now working again in Firefox. And if we go back into IE, we've still got that floated layout. So you can see that what you can actually do there is you can start to kind of enhance the layout for older browsers by using the tried and tested methods that we had by float. So this doesn't look great yet, but if you sort of went through and sort of played around with it and put all the different bits together, went through each element and said, well, what can we do with that if we're in a browser that doesn't support grid? What can we do with this next thing? And then combine that with using the fact that CSS just overwrites some of these things. So in the spec, it says that a floated item that becomes a grid item is no longer a floated thing. So you don't have to worry about the float. What you just need to do is make sure that your widths are set back to auto. What I tend to find is that inside my feature queries, I've got lots of setting widths back to auto. and I've got a bunch of removing margins on things. So if I've used margins to get around the fact we don't have grid gap or a gap property in old IE, I'm sort of removing that because I'm using the gap, which makes for a much better display. And it's surprising how far you can get like this. And really how far you want to take it depends on how many people are actually coming to your website in those browsers. If it turns out that not many people are, then you can start to say, well, I'm not going to do very much here. And maybe I'm going to make this a fixed width centered thing and do some very basic layout for those old browsers, and they'll get something which is usable. That is a much better approach than trying to sort of polyfill your grid layout and use JavaScript to position things, because then you're basically stuffing all that JavaScript to the browser that can least handle it, and to an older browser that's not that great at dealing with this stuff. So I would tend to go for creating something simple but decent for those older browsers that's going to be nice and fast for them to load. It's going to be usable, because actually increasingly that's going to be better than an awful lot of the things they see, because they're going to be coming across a lot of things that just don't work at all in their browser. And that's kind of sort of a better way to deal with this stuff. So that's about 45 minutes. I will tidy this up, and what I will do is I will stick some comments through the code, and I will get this up onto CodePen probably the next couple of days. I've got to go and get on a plane tomorrow morning, but I'll try and get this sorted out so that you can come and have a look. And what I said I would do for the last sort of few minutes would be to answer any questions that you have based on this.
Thanks, Rachel. That was awesome, as always. We do have a few questions here. So I am just going to... Okay, we have a question from Michael asking, what does browser support look like for Grid and IE? And I know you've touched upon this quite a bit. Specifically, is there a polyfill to help support IE?
No, and I wouldn't try and polyfill Grid. If you tried to polyfill Grid with a JavaScript polyfill, and just for anyone who's not really aware of what that means, typically polyfills are things which try and patch in the support in a browser for something which isn't supported by that browser. Now that might be fine for, say, polyfilling a selector or something like that. You don't want to try and polyfill your layout. It's going to just make the most awful experience in those older browsers, because you'd have to just try and get equal height columns with JavaScript. You know, is actually quite a heavy thing to do. So trying to do all the things that Grid does, it's just not going to be nice. Increasingly, and you're also talking about a browser which is going away. So I think increasingly you should try and create a simpler layout, as I was doing, rather than trying to throw a load of JavaScript at the problem.
James has a question. To support IE, is there a media query that can be used to feature detect the availability of Grid?
Well, that's basically what I showed you. It's not a media query, although it's part of the CSS conditionals. Right. So there's feature queries, which is the Layout supports. You can detect any property and value pair with feature queries. So you need to use a property and value. So you're saying @supports display grid, or you could say @supports grid template columns subgrid to check for something that supports subgrid. You can also test for like vendor prefix things and so on. Feature queries are supported in everything. They're not supported in old IE, but it doesn't matter, because typically what you're doing there is you're creating your old layout and then you're overwriting, just as I did in the demo. You're overwriting with your new stuff. So it doesn't matter if things don't support feature queries and don't support Grid, because they just will ignore the feature queries stuff. And then you can just overwrite it with your Grid layout.
Okay. Matilda is asking, Rachel, when actually working on a real project and thinking about the non-Grid version, do you do it the same as here? Meaning first the Grid layout and then back to make it okay in IE, or do you do the no Grid version first and then do the Grid version?
Typically, I will build the layout that is going to work on most browsers. So I would, at this point, I would be using Grid layout because it's not like doing fallbacks in the past where you had to write huge amounts of CSS to get your layout to work, and then you'd look at it and it'll be broken. You write very minimal CSS these days to get a layout to work. And it's then typically fairly easy to start just poking at that and enhancing bits that need enhancing for browsers that don't support Grid. because you can kind of work with normal flow and work with the fact that things are actually readable in normal flow. And then you can just sort of kind of start tweaking things. And the same for kind of adding in support for like really new features, like something like SubGrid, or some other feature that, you know, that one browser has shipped and you think, oh, I'm going to add that just because it'll be nice for people with that browser. And also the site will kind of grow into new browsers as things ship. So I would say build the layout for the 90%, and then look at iterating on that for the other browsers that you need to support, you know, based on what you're seeing coming to your site.
All right. Roma is asking, thank you, Rachel. Why don't you use span option?
The span option for grid columns, sometimes I do. Yeah, you could do. It's not a conscious choice. Oh, I'm not using it. It's just, yeah, you could do. Yeah, so you can say like grid column start 1, grid column end span 3, which is span over 3 columns. So yeah, so you can use the span option, or you can use the column line number. It's totally up to you, really.
Awesome. John's asking, do you still use Modernizr to detect CSS features?
No.
No.
I've not used Modernizr for a very long time.
I knew the answer to that. I'm bad with first names sometimes. When do you think GAP would be supported for Flexgrid in all browsers?
Well, so GAP is supported for grid in all browsers. Any browser which supports grid layout will support GAP. It is not supported for Flexbox. I would imagine, and I don't know, I'm guessing, but Chrome are currently working on a project called Layout NG, which is basically a sort of a rebuild of their layout engine. They're starting to ship that now. I would imagine that the GAP property of Flexbox is behind that shipping, because if they're rewriting great chunks of their layout engine, they're probably not going to want to implement new code on the old engine. So things like SubGrid as well, I think, are behind Layout NG shipping. So hopefully once that happens, we'll start to see some of these features then get into Chrome. But I think at the moment they're sort of busy rebuilding their sort of layout engine to make it faster and better and make it easier to do all this new stuff. So I think that's probably what's happening. Time scales on that, I don't know. I say I don't work for Chrome, but I know that generally browsers don't want to not support these things. It's not because they want to make your life hard. It's that just like any business, time has to go into implementing features and getting them out there for us. So we just kind of have to be patient.
Okay, fair enough. Lance is asking, how well would what we've done so far in the presentation look like in a mobile viewport?
I mean, I didn't do anything for responsive design. I didn't really have enough time. What I would probably do for that layout is, well, you could do two things. You could use the autofill stuff for grid, so you could basically autofill with as many columns as possible. That might well work quite nicely for that. But it would really be fairly simple tweaks. You could chuck in a media query and just redefine the grid to be like a 2-column grid, for example, and then lay the items out on that. I may well have a go. We've got sirens outside now. I may well try and tidy this up and maybe chuck in a couple of media queries to sort of show you what that would look like while I'm at it. So it would be fairly straightforward. As I say, it's generally with grid, it's so easy to redefine the grid or to redefine where things sit on the grid. I think you can sort of play around with media queries quite easily.
Mr. Scott Gruber, friend of the Smashing family, have you blogged about the CSS properties, or which are overwritten by grid? Or do you
several times. Yeah, several times. I think there's at least one Smashing article which goes into that. Probably something to do with supporting older browsers. It's all in the spec. I mean, basically, floats and clear don't apply once they're a grid item. Display inline block, display table will be overwritten once they become a grid item. Essentially, if things that are defined for normal flow, so things like floats and so on, they just don't work once they're in a grid formatting context. Okay. So that means that you can just overwrite them sort of naturally.
Marikoto is asking as well, is there any particular reason you use list items for your structure rather than divs? But I believe that's due to grid, correct?
No, I mean, yeah, I could have used divs. I felt that that looked like a list. It was a list of news items. So
Yeah.
I used Eliza. As I say, the markup was fairly arbitrary. If you the actual markup, I think on the BBC site is quite well nested because obviously they have very different browser support requirements to a lot of us. So I just thought, well, that's actually a list of news items. If I was marking that up on my site, I'd probably use a list because that seems to make sense. But you know, grid layout would work with anything. You just need to have that structure.
Yeah, and I think the negative fallout from that was if it's in a list item, it's actually going to be structured a bit better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's structured, and it means that if something didn't support any CSS, they would get a list of news items, which actually that's what that is.
Yeah. When do you think we should be expecting CSS subgrid to land? And do you think it'll be adopted in the same way that CSS grid was adopted?
Well, say SubGrid is in Firefox, and I think it is behind, again, as with FlexGap stuff, I think it's probably behind Layout NG and Chrome. I don't think they're going to be, in fact, I think, you know, one of the engineers commented on the bug on Chrome for SubGrid that, yeah, you know, it's waiting for Layout NG to be shipped. So hopefully next year sometime, because it makes a lot of layouts an awful lot easier.
Yeah. Do you see any limitations with grid for building layouts? Have you run into any?
Not really. I mean, there are a few things that would be nice to change. I mean, the issue where it's quite useful to be able to not use floats. You know, floats don't apply when you're in grid layout. But actually, sometimes you might want a float to kind of line up with the grid, and there's actually no way to do that at the moment. So there's various little patterns that you start to try and do and think, oh, you know, we probably need something else here. And there are other specs, things like the exclusion spec and regions, which would solve some of those problems. But I think the thing is, as we're building more and more stuff, we're going to find problems. And that's actually, as someone who works on CSS, that's gold dust, because that's the next thing to solve. You know, the problems that people are coming up against and saying, well, we can't build this yet. I'm like, well, how can we build this? You know, what's the next thing that we need? So do keep talking about your sort of use cases, because it's only by seeing the use cases that we can design new CSS to actually solve them.
Vitaly piped in with a question. It's a very long question.
Of course.
So with custom properties, nesting and Houdini CSS now coming to CSS, do you feel that just in a few years, Sass will be fading into oblivion, just like jQuery isn't necessarily the first choice when it comes to a framework these days?
Mm-hmm. I think, yeah. I mean, I have started off building sites recently where I have, you know, just got all my Sass and stuff in place, because that's what I always do. And then I'm looking at it and I'm like, I'm actually not using this for very much at all. So there's nothing wrong with using Sass. If you find it handy, to use mix-ins or whatever, that's cool. But I think increasingly, yes, CSS is sort of taking over from the requirement. And obviously using things like custom properties, there's a lot more power than just doing things in Sass, because you can actually then calculate them on the fly. You know, as the viewport changes, you can make that calculation and what have you, which you can't do with Sass. So yeah, I think that CSS is moving us away from needing it for a lot of things. I tend to probably use a post processor more than anything these days. So for instance, I might have used a load of custom properties, and I want to end up with a static value for anything that doesn't support the custom properties. Well, I might use a post processor to do that, that sort of thing. So yeah, I think we are moving away from that, and that's good, you know, because that's us looking at use cases and saying, well, people are doing this thing. How can we do that better and do that natively?
So last question. What are you excited about these days personally?
I think just carrying on solving these problems. I mean, you know, looking at what is next. I mean, it's amazing to me how far we've actually come, and how, you know, I'm now seeing sites all the time that are built using grid layout, that you know, are big sites, are out there in sort of in the wild. And we're really not very far into having grid at all. So I think that's quite exciting, and sort of seeing the adoption of it and how it's made people's lives easier. And for me, that's what it's about. You know, it's working on this stuff is about making the platform better so we can all do our jobs better, do this stuff faster. make it more performant and more accessible. All of that stuff is why I work on the web platform. It's just to be making it better for all of us. And so that's what excites me really, is just keeping on picking at those problems and solving them.
Very cool. We did have one other question that's popped in. Jerome's asking, how do you reset styles when you start a project, or do you still do that, the CSS resets?
Not a lot. As I say, I didn't do, and I tend not to in demos because I think it can be a bit sort of obscure just to have things that change stuff. I don't do a lot these days. Browsers are pretty good with their default styling. And what I often would do is do things like, normalize all my margins on things. So margins that I tend to find it easier if there's only margins on the bottom of stuff. And so I might do that kind of thing. There's a few bits and bobs that I do with forms and form elements and so on. But yeah, I don't do a heavy-handed sort of reset, because I find that then typically what I do is I spend my whole time putting all that stuff back. I mean, back in the day, it was more useful because browsers did different things with their default styles, but they don't so much anymore. So you can get away with not doing too much. As I say, your mileage may vary. That's kind of how I like to do it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, on that note, thank you, Rachel. It was amazing as always. And I just want to let all the smashing or attendees know that we're going to be taking a little break over the holidays. So happy holidays to everybody, and we hope you have a great holiday. We keep an eye out in your email. We will have some surprises coming up. The next webinar should be early January, and it's going to be with Adam Silver, who did the Form Design Patterns book. I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And he's going to be doing a live session on refactoring forms. So keep an eye out for that. So on that note, Rachel, thank you very much. And I hope you have a good holiday as well. And we will talk to you soon.
Okay. Take care, everyone.
Bye, everybody.